Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this evening's History Talks live session, Power and Representation in Different Places and Spaces, new books from the Centre for History. I'm Dr. Jim Macpherson. I'm sure most of you know who I am, and I have the pleasure of chairing this evening's session. And thank you to all of you for joining us to celebrate the recent publication of these two wonderful books. First of all, Dr. Lucy Dean's Death and the Royal Succession in Scotland, a great picture of her there holding the book. It's always a great moment where you get to actually hold the thing in your hand. It's real, it exists, it's alive. And the second book, Dr. Nicola Martin's The British Army in Scotland and North America, 1745 to 1775. So really looking forward to hearing both of our authors discuss their work, and we'll have a chance for discussion afterwards, which would be great. First up, though, is Dr. Lucy Dean, our senior lecturer and current interim head of the centre. Her book was published by Boydell in 2024, so only just a year ago. And it brings together many of her wider interests, including royal studies, ritual and ceremony, material, culture, approaches and methodology, gender and life cycle, including youth and old age, and indeed public history. And one of her key projects at the moment ongoing is being the co-lead on the Perth Charterhouse project. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that lovely introduction, and I'm really looking forward to taking part in this. I'm mostly to hearing more about Nicola's book than talking about mine, but I will start then with this quote from T.S. Eliot: "To make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from." As the book does, that I'm introducing this evening, I am going to start at the end, which is also a very good beginning. So, in January 1543, a sombre procession set out from Falkland Palace in Fife towards Edinburgh. The King of Scotland, James V, had died in late December, aged 30, only days after the birth of his daughter and heir Mary. Between his death and early January, the King's body was prepared for his final journey. Prayers were said for his soul, his body embalmed, vigils held in the palace chapel, and jewel wear or funeral garb prepared for the attendees. The body and accompanying procession moved slowly, likely pausing for overnight vigils at Dunfermline, amongst James's ancient and saintly ancestors, before being conveyed by boat from Fife across the Forth to make its way to Edinburgh. The number of people in attendance grew on approach to the borough, including the widowed Queen Consort, Marie de Guise, and her ladies in a chariot draped in black cloth, drawn by horses fitted out with black harnesses. The procession carried the coffined king and his effigy through the streets towards Holyrood Abbey in the Canongate. The effigy, in regalia and royal robes made for the occasion, acted as a replacement for the body and may have been intended to represent the visual embodiment of the body politic or the royal dignity that lived on despite the mortality of human monarchs. The deceased king was accompanied not only by his queen consort, but also by heralds and mace bearers, the borough elite and members of the court, including James Hamilton, Earl of Arran, soon to be governor of the realm, in a dual cape of state. All were led by black-clad paupers bearing torches to the sounds of lamentable trumpets and whistles of jewel. The interior of Holyrood Abbey was draped in black. Before the altar stood a hearse, a chapel-like structure decorated with 648 great and small coats of arms, clubs, swords, and other tools of war, all in gold and bright colours amidst a sea of black. Beneath the structure, the king's effigy lay resplendent in the flickering light of a plethora of candles and torches. The realm mourned the loss of the monarch and prepared to crown its first queen regnant. The king is dead. Long live the queen. The ritual cycle of death and succession marked both an end and a new beginning. The phrase "the king is dead, long live the queen," or "long live the king," stands at the heart of this book, and from its title onwards, it emphasises the unambiguous connection between death and succession, with a particular focus on representations of royal power made for or by the monarch at these critical moments. That death begins the ritual cycle of succession may seem like a rather obvious observation, but it is often overlooked, and not just in a Scottish context. There is a substantial body of research on royal funerals, inaugurations, and coronations, particularly for England and France. However, despite directly or the directly or indirectly integrated nature of these events, very few studies consider these ritual ceremonials as a whole. Moreover, the study of Scottish ceremonies prior to this book tended to cluster around the inauguration of Alexander III in 1249, and then around 16th century spectacles and royal entries, primarily but not exclusively associated with royal marriages and baptisms. This is in part a result of the types of sources that survive. For example, there are both written accounts and with a reasonable amount of detail and visual depictions of the inauguration in 1249, which is almost unheard of for Scottish king-making ceremonies either before or after. Whereas the 16th century is where we have the richest surviving royal and burghal financial records. However, while there are challenges with the sources for studying Scottish royal ceremonial developments, and I'd be happy to discuss the sources utilised more in questions, this does not fully explain the absence of further investigation into broader ceremonial developments. So consequently, this book embraces a wide and varied range of sources to undertake a longue durée analysis across 4 centuries from the death of William I in 1214 to the burial of James V and accession of Mary in 1543. Incorporating funerals, accession ceremonies, marriages, and the ceremonial promotion of heirs in chronological order. By considering the interwoven ceremonies that facilitated or marked the transferal of negotiation and renegotiation of royal power within the cycle of dynastic succession, the study addresses continuity and change in the ongoing performative dialogue between the monarch and the kingdom to offer new insights into Scottish kingship, the practical exercising of authority, and the idea of transferring royal dignity from one generation or dynasty to the next. Putting the study into chronological order was one of the most significant changes from the doctoral thesis research from which this book developed, as that was arranged by ceremony type, and this was a far more complex change than I had envisaged at the start of the process. The reasons for this choice were threefold, however. To better address the lacuna noted previously and reconnect the ceremonies of death and succession into this cycle, to provide a followable narrative for the non-expert of Scottish history, and to make sure that the variable contexts were fully interpreted as part of the evidence for understanding the ritual developments. So many of the features found in the displays of 1543 that I relayed previously had long roots in Scotland's ritual past, but the description of James V's funeral could, at the first glance at least, be mistaken for ceremonies occurring in any number of 16th century kingdoms in Europe at that time. That these ceremonies were recognisable to foreign audiences was important to an outward-looking Renaissance monarch like James V and his recently widowed wife Mary de Guise. Yet these ceremonies were not identical to any other. They were at once identifiable and uniquely malleable, universally understood but locally defined. Societies do not remain static, so neither do the ceremonies and ritual actions that they adopt. Moreover, the very nature of the ceremonies that marked the cycle of death and succession meant that they often occurred at times of heightened tension and, in many cases, in the Scottish context particularly, with little warning or time to prepare. Joel Burden and other ritual scholars have argued that, open quote, the apparent conservatism of ritual practices will often veil a reality in which ritual traditions are not static but continually reproduced. This is critical to understanding the development of rituals within the Scottish ceremonial cycle of succession, even if it may jar with some of our understandings of ritual as something which we commonly associated with actions being undertaken repetitively in a prescribed or easily recognizable way. There was, of course, a necessity for elements that were rooted in continuity and repetition that spoke to a shared understanding of precedent and expectation. However, a carbon copy of an earlier ritual was almost impossible in such irregularly held ceremonies situated within complex varying contexts. The context of the power transition in 1543 was unique to those that came before or those that occurred elsewhere, so there were both subtle and marked developments and innovations caused by specific circumstances that were essential to draw into the analysis. For example, the involvement of those who were likely to take the reins of government on behalf of an underage monarch in Scottish royal funerals can be traced back as early as 1329, and Robert the Steward's role as one of the chief mourners, or even as early as 1214 when the young Alexander II met his uncle Earl David at a bridge outside the borough of Perth to accompany the funerary procession of William I to Arbroath. It is not until 1543 and the succession of a days-old baby girl with a powerful and influential French mother who attends the funeral in pomp and ceremony only weeks after her birth that the heir apparent and likely guardian or governor of the realm decided to adorn a cape of state that so blatantly stated his position in the hierarchy. Between the early 13th century, don't worry, you don't need to read all of this. It's just to give you a bit of an idea of the kind of things that I'm the time range that I'm covering and the varying complexities of the ages of some of these monarchs as they come to the throne. But between the early 13th and mid 16th century, Scotland saw 3 changes of dynasty, several crises of succession of varying degrees, including 2 wars of independence from 1296 to 1328, and then from 1332 to 1357. And in a period of approximately 300 years, there was more than 120 years without an adult monarch at the helm. This was either due to minorities, absentee kings. This included imprisonment in England for David II, for example, from 1346 to 1357, and James I, also imprisoned in England between 1406 and 1424. And also aging kings who were replaced with or supported by lieutenants. These issues are unsurprisingly central to many discussions in the historiography of Scottish kingship and politics in this period. Yet relatively little analysis considers the role of or impact on royal rituals marking the passage of succession across the longue durée in relation to this issue. Dougal Shaw stated in 2004 that the high volume of minorities occurring in Scotland during the late medieval and early modern period had a detrimental impact upon the ritual developments, and that the coronation therefore remained correspondingly immature. The book sought to unpick and challenge this statement for 3 main reasons. Firstly, the implication that the lack of an adult monarch impedes the development of ritual and the polity from which it emerges, clashes with the frequency with which late medieval and early modern European dynasties dealt with succession of infants and children. Even if the Scottish kingdom suffered particularly badly from an absence of adult royal power at critical junctures, this was an inherent pitfall associated with all hereditary monarchies that many realms faced, and similar criticisms have not been universally levelled. Secondly, recent scholarship on the Scottish Parliament, guardianship, the office of regent, and the practical exercising of power in Scotland all points to the way that the Scottish political community upheld and developed their practical mechanisms of authority in such challenging times, including Roland Tanner's statement that the 15th century, which witnessed 4 significant periods of minority, also witnessed the zenith of the Scottish medieval parliament. I argue through a range of examples woven through the book that the various guardians, lieutenants, and regents, including clerics, nobles, and widowed queens, all had as much, if not more, reason to utilise ceremonial representations of royal authority on behalf of a minor monarch to secure and stabilise the realm. Therefore, the continuation and development of the ritual cycle itself, with or without an adult monarch, provides unique evidence for the investment by king and community alike in the concept of the crown or royal dignity that transcended the individual who became the ruler. Finally, the statement from Shaw speaks to a common presumption that the kingdoms where ceremonies were not overtly Christianized or maintained strong secular elements were in some way lesser, and I think this is highly contestable. It is based on an Anglo-French centric view of what was important in the rituals that facilitated succession, with a particular emphasis on unction or anointing, a rite that Scottish kings were not gifted by the Pope until 1329. Even Scottish medievalists such as Archie Duncan tend to suggest the secular nature of the Scottish inauguration was a weakness, particularly in comparison to England. However, there is a growing body of work considering kingdoms that actively rejected unction or developed with different dominant influences that challenge this Anglo-French dominance in terms of what was a ceremonial norm and indeed rulership norms more generally. The book actively extends this ongoing discourse and builds on challenges from the likes of Alice Taylor and Norman Reed to the traditional views surrounding the impact of the Anglo-Norman influences and associated Anglicisation of the Scottish kingdom. It does so by actively focusing on the context in which the Scottish rituals of death and succession developed and occurred, drawing on the complex web of internal and external influences impacting Scottish culture and politics through this period, including a keen focus on regions such as Scandinavia, Ireland, and the Low Countries, rather than just England and France. In doing so, it argues the differences between Scotland's rituals and those of England should not be presumed to be some type of inferiority. Rather, these differences were indicative of the kingdom's political, cultural, and social landscape. A useful example of looking at this is the first adult coronation after the rite of unction was granted, that of Robert II in 1371. He was the first of the Stuart dynasty. While an early 20th century historian suggested that he was crowned with using all the majesty of Western Christendom, the surviving evidence suggests that rather than embracing wholesale change, Robert II re-emphasised the secular. He split the ceremony over 2 days, with the church-bound coronation with anointing and the bestowal of regalia on the first, very much fixed within the abbey space, and the second day centred on an open-air enthronement on the Moot Hill at Scone, on which he exchanged oaths with his elites. This is actually the first coronation in Scotland where we can actually fairly certainly say that the Moot Hill was used, whereas previously it was probably in the churchyard of the abbey. Despite the right to anoint and a copy of a French order of ceremony likely to be held in the hands of the Bishop of Glasgow, who helped him organise the ceremony, Robert II used secular and ecclesiastic spaces at Scone in 1371 to capitalise on the value of ritual actions that illuminated consensual king-making in an effort to dispel any doubts about his right to rise from the ranks of the nobility to rule, but in a way that emphasised his understanding that the Scottish king was, at this time at least, essentially a first among equals. Scottish rituals of kingship were developed in a specifically unique context and thus can offer fascinating insights into the people, culture, and political machinations of the realm in which they were shaped and redesigned. As I'm very aware that I'm definitely either slightly over or fast approaching my 15-minute limit for this brief introduction, and I'm keen to give Nicola plenty of time, I'll wrap up there. But I'm also aware I've barely scratched the surface of what could be discussed, so I'm very happy to answer questions and greatly look forward to the discussion part of the session.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Lucy. Wonderful stuff. It's so refreshing to see a book like this that takes one key element of a polity and considers it over such a long period of time. That is an amazing thing. So thank you very much for sharing that. As we said at the beginning, we'll segue into Dr. Nicola Martin's wee presentation now, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion afterwards. So Nicola, over to you. I'll briefly introduce. Dr. Nicola Martin is a lecturer in Scottish, British, and American history at the Centre for History, UHI, and is also program leader for our undergraduate programs. Nicola's book, The British Army in Scotland and North America, Militarisation on the Fringes of Empire, that was published in June by Palgrave Macmillan. There it is, looking beautiful. I hadn't realised how green the spine was. That's great and a beautiful colour. So Nicola is a transatlantic military historian, particularly interested in social, cultural, and political aspects of warfare and Britain's 18th century empire, all of which are explored in this magnificent new book. So really looking forward, Nicola, to hearing all about it. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Jim. And yes, so going to quite a different place and time than Lucy was talking about, and quite a different type of power and representation. But I think the themes definitely come through in both books. So in October 1769, Thomas Gage, the British Commander-in-Chief in North America, wrote to a subordinate about the non-importation agreement that colonists had enacted in protest of the Townshend Acts, which taxed various British goods that were imported to the colonies. Gage was concerned that colonists might take their protests a stage further and attack British merchant ships. He informed his subordinate that, quote, "If any accident happens to the goods, the proprietors will, from their consequence at home, be better able to procure redress and show the British nation the American provinces are no longer British." Gage's statement demonstrates that he did not view the colonists as Britons who were equal in status to Britons at home. Indeed, Gage had been convinced that the colonists were not Britons, but simply one more imperial population group that the British had to manage within the empire for several years. Further, he believed that they were an imperial population group that were potentially hostile to British aims and interests. And during the Stamp Act crisis, the Stamp Act riots in 1766, he had instructed another subordinate that, quote, "If these sons of liberty fire upon you, you will not then trouble yourself about orders. I am to desire, if they dare fire upon the king's troops, become rebels, that you will give them a good dressing, beat these sons of liberty into loyal subjects." Now, Gage was not alone in viewing the colonists as potentially hostile, othering them, and arguing for strong measures or even military action against them in order to inculcate loyalty to the British imperial state. A decade before the Stamp Act riots, during the French and Indian War, the then British commander John Campbell, 4th Earl of Loudoun, had faced numerous frustrations conducting the war effort and attempting to ensure the cooperation of colonists and colonial authorities. Loudoun had written to the Duke of Cumberland, stating that the ministry needed to establish an independent fund to pay the colonial governors and a new model for colonial government. He warned that this needed to be introduced immediately, as, quote, "If you delay till a peace, you will not have a force to exert any British Acts of Parliament here. For though they will not go so far as with me, I am assured by the officers that it is not uncommon for the people of this country to say they would be glad to see any man that dare exert a British Act of Parliament here." Loudoun warned Cumberland that the colonists were potentially willing to rebel against British imperial control almost a decade before the Stamp Act riots and 2 decades prior to the Declaration of Independence. In othering the colonists and recommending an immediate reformation of the relationship between the colonies and the mother country, Loudoun drew on his and the army's recent experiences in Scotland. In Scotland, the army had advocated and implemented closer regulation over the population as a method of ensuring imperial security and encouraging assimilation and loyalty of the population to the crown. And Loudoun believed that similar steps, albeit targeted to the specifics of the colonial situation, should also be taken in North America. And such a conclusion would likewise be reached by Gage and by numerous British Army officers who served in North America even. My book investigates why officers like Loudon and Gage developed such markedly different understandings of imperial loyalty and identity, and particularly regarding the identity of colonial settlers, long before such changes became widespread in Britain. And similarly, it investigates how, as they increasingly began to other colonists, they simultaneously began to question the sustainability of an empire of negotiation, and instead to advocate for imperial reform, drawing on prior experiences in both Scotland and North America in order to urge the military pacification of the colonists in order to ensure imperial security. So the book examines militarisation in both countries from the Jacobite uprising of 1745 to the outbreak of the American Revolutionary War in 1775, investigating the experiences and encounters of the British Army on these two imperial fringes. It demonstrates how these experiences shaped the attitudes of army officers who were involved, and how they influenced the army more generally. It considers the impact of these changing attitudes on the implementation of empire and on the coming of the American Revolution. And such a study is important because most of the scholarship of the American Revolution focuses on the French and Indian War as a key turning point, and the extent of Britain's victory in that conflict is often credited with causing the imperial crisis. But this book shows the longer term military interactions that dated back to the 45, the role that they played in causing transformations in 18th century British imperial policy. And by focusing on army officers who were responsible for implementing and shaping policy on the ground, and who played a key role in influencing British ministers, it provides insights into the role of these important agents of empire in the coming of the American Revolution. And so what I thought I'd just do this evening is to give a couple of very brief examples from the book that highlight some of the ways that the army took its experiences of warfare and pacification in Scotland with them to North America, and then adapted them to the conditions that they found there. So when the British Army was first sent to North America in 1755, the colonies were thought of as an extension of Britain, and colonists were part of an inclusive British identity. During the 45, however, Scottish Highlanders had not been viewed as part of that inclusive Britishness, but rather were seen as others, associated with incivility, alien customs and language, and the clan system. And this led officers to label the Jacobite uprising as a Highland rebellion, despite the fact that there was widespread participation throughout Scotland. The British commander, William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, undertook a campaign of military execution, which primarily targeted Highlanders. The army engaged in wide-scale destruction of houses and resources, and the general scorching of the countryside in areas where civilians had refused to comply with the orders of the army or were simply suspected of doing so. Soldiers were dispatched throughout the Highlands with orders to kill any that they found in arms, and to burn the houses of those who were not at home, upon the presumption that they must therefore be out in the rising. And little or no distinction was made between those who had been fighting with the Jacobites and those who had not. The long-term measures centred on military occupation and intimidation, and the civilisation and assimilation of Highlanders. As well as the military occupation of Scotland, there was a concerted road and fort building exercise undertaken, concentrated in the Highlands. Renewed emphasis was placed on military surveying through the creation of an accurate military map, known as the Roy Map. And in addition to providing intelligence and tactical support, the map was to act as a method of military intimidation and imposition, and to enable effective governance of an occupied region. Now, whilst intimidation sought to prevent renewed rebellion, civilisation and assimilation were thought necessary in order to inculcate loyalty and ensure peace in the longer term. Post-Culloden plans for civilising the Highlands tended to draw on emerging Enlightenment theories, such as the annexing of the 13 Highland estates to the Crown, to try and allow the government to control property, introduce improvement measures, and thereby theoretically encourage commercialisation. Now, in 1759, Culloden veteran James Wolfe commanded the British attempt to conquer Quebec and employed similarly violent tactics against the French Canadian and Indigenous populations to achieve his imperial aims. Wolfe reintroduced monetary rewards for scalps, not only for Indigenous peoples, as had been common in the past, but also for French Canadians who were campaigning with them. Wolfe further launched a campaign of destruction against Quebec and the surrounding area in an attempt to demoralise the civilian population and to pressure the French army into a decisive engagement. His bombardment of Quebec caused little damage to French military capabilities, but destroyed hundreds of houses, whilst the wider campaign against settlements up the St. Lawrence River saw British troops burn houses and crops, seize provisions and livestock, and kill civilians. And similar tactics were again used by the British Army under Commander Geoffrey Amherst during various conflicts with Indigenous peoples, including Pontiac's War. The army undertook a fire and sword campaign, burning whole villages and giving monetary rewards for scalps, even extending this to those who brought in the scalps of Indigenous women and children. And Amherst even sought to make use of germ warfare, ordering a subordinate to try and spread smallpox through the Indigenous nations at Fort Pitt. Now, the longer-term measures implemented by the British Army and state in Quebec and throughout the interior also reflected those that were trialled in Scotland a decade earlier. Investment in military infrastructure and a large-scale mapping project of the St. Lawrence Valley once again sought not only to provide intelligence, but also to act as a method of subjugation and intimidation towards the local population. And although he was careful to allow and indeed to advocate for short-term toleration of Catholicism in Quebec, British commander in the region James Murray also mirrored British imperial attempts to enlighten and anglicise a suspect population through improvement and commercialisation. In 1762, he highlighted the agricultural potential of the colony and urged moves towards the production of hemp and flax, alongside a shift in focus from the fur trade to the fisheries. In the interior, the British sought to regulate commerce between Indigenous peoples and frontier settlers through closer regulation by imperial agents that was set out in the Plan for the Future Management of Indian Affairs, and for a time kept a strong military presence throughout the interior to try and prevent future uprisings and Indigenous frontier violence. Now, these experiences, and lots of others discussed in the book, suggested two important things to army officers who were concerned with implementing empire in North America. First, militarisation had shown that assimilation was not a necessary precedent for securing the loyalty of imperial populations. In both Scotland and Quebec, the population was displaying continued submission and adherence to the imperial state, despite the fact that they had certainly not been anglicised or assimilated. This forced a rethinking regarding the status of population groups within the empire, who came to be seen as imperial subjects with rights and responsibilities as part of the empire like Britain's, yet who were clearly differentiated from Britons at home. And experiences in both countries led many army officers, though not all, towards accommodating such groups within the empire rather than seeking their assimilation. And second, although accommodation increasingly came to be a preferred strategy for governing imperial subjects, it was also believed that they needed to be closely regulated, and military pacification and intimidation were considered important tools for ensuring imperial security. There was absolutely no room for an empire of negotiation in the way that the imperial relationship with colonists had functioned for many years. And at the same time, army officers were shaping new identities for imperial others, the British identity of colonial North American settlers was simultaneously eroded. And this process began during the French and Indian War as successive commanders were left frustrated when colonists failed to act as they believed it was their duty to as Britons, for example, by failing to comply with demands for assistance for the common prosecution of the war. It was consolidated in the aftermath of the war as tensions solidified when British militarisation strategy was extended. And this led to calls for closer regulation and later the military pacification of the colonists, who by the 1760s were not seen by army officers as Britons, but as potential rebels against the crown. And it's this change in the attitudes of British Army officers, driven by their experiences and interactions with a range of population groups in both Scotland and in North America, that the book explores in much more detail. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nicola. Really, really enjoy that. I think that there's so much in your work, in your book, to get our teeth into. From my point of view, I love how you talk about the emergence of this idea of colonial difference at such an early stage, and being driven by this particular group, that these army officers are central to imperial policy. I think it's a brilliant way of thinking about how empire evolves in the middle of the 18th century, at a much earlier period than many have considered these kinds of changes taking effect. So thank you very much. That's got my mind fizzing beautifully. Right, excellent. So we've got some time for discussion and questions.
Just, Jim, are we stopping the recording?
I've just stopped now. Yes.
Cool.
The recording has stopped.
Yeah, that's fine.
Right, so yes,
sharing,
we have some good time for question and discussion. So fire away. Do holler, raise a hand. I thought I saw